All right, thank you everybody for signing up for this. I just came running in from Fanshawe men's practice, so if I run out of breath here a few minutes in, give me a second. So tonight the plan is to chat a little bit about defensive relationship between the front row backcourt, kind of how we try and do things here with the Fanshawe men's team. And I'll encourage you, seriously, Kelvin mentioned it, but if there are any questions at all, I find these go a lot better when we get some discussion going. I gave a similar presentation to this on Sunday in person at Fanshawe. Probably a little bit easier with live athletes and being able to demonstrate some things. So if some of the more technical things you have any questions about, please feel free to just type it in there. I've got the questions tab open here so I can see and I can answer. All right, so I tried my best to break this into three pieces. The individual defender and blocking, then the blocker and defender cohesion. So the first piece there is just the actual ability to perform the skills. And I kind of chop that into the behavioral, intangible type pieces. So defensive attitude, the understanding of the system that your team is trying to put in place. And then we're going to move into a bit of the cue reading, decision making piece that, in my opinion, doesn't get talked about enough. Then we're going to slide into the actual technical ability, the skills that we often train. I feel like number 3 there on the screen gets talked about a ton, but number 2 doesn't, and definitely number 1 doesn't. So we'll talk about the individuals. Then we're going to slide into the blocker-defender relationship. So say the blocker in zone 4 and the defender in zone 5 and the relationship they have with one another. Talk a bit about trust and discipline as far as a team defense. We'll talk a bit about posture, again, to the technical side of things. And we'll finish off trying to bring it all together, talking about the defensive system, and to stress that it needs to be a team defensive system, that we don't want to have any athletes thinking that they need to go and defend the entire court themselves, especially your more physical athletes that say do get a lot of blocks. We need to make sure we let them have some fun, and for sure we want them to enjoy themselves, but we got to make sure they're doing it within the confines of what our team system's actually doing. So the first thing to chat about, the actual individual blocker and defender. So the first piece there is attitude. I talked a bit about this on Sunday in person, and we talked that attitude is by far the most important, and I wholeheartedly believe that. The defenders that want to defend the ball are going to be a lot more likely to actually work hard to put themselves in the right place to defend balls. We need to make sure that from a blocking perspective that we have trust and discipline in our system, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit as far as athletes need to understand your system inside and out and not just in their position. So for me at Fanshawe, we have our guys roll through nearly every position in the first week, and that might sound crazy because they're high performance athletes that have been playing one position for quite a while, but we find that even just 20 minutes playing in another position allows them to see how difficult they can make their teammates' lives if they decide to go outside of our system and be undisciplined. So that kind of plays into the understanding of their assignments. And it's going to sound, I think, tonight like at times we're looking for whose fault was it, but that's not at all what we're trying to do. The point of a team system is to know which assignment was the reason we didn't make a play, and be able to use that to guide our training, essentially. So we talk about defense being fun. For me, I try my best in the first couple of weeks of the season to make sure that we celebrate defense more than anything. My teams are often better defensively than offensively, and I firmly believe that, especially at the OVA level and into the college level, that defense is significantly more important than even having a strong offense. So one point I wanted to make before we roll on, I'm sure everyone's played some or seen some type of a touch 6 or a touch 10 as a punishment. And if I had one thing to say, I try and say it to any of the coaches I work with in our club, is touch 6 can be awesome, and it can be a great defensive drill that builds grit, that can work on a bit of heart and desire and drive. But I feel like when it gets used as punishment, then that starts to turn into athletes dreading defense, and that's definitely not what we want. So we use it as, we call it a grit builder. So anytime we're into anything that is really focused on hitting the floor and that defensive intensity, we got to make sure we spin it as a positive and something they want to do, not something that they have to do if they're being punished for something. So next step for the individual defender and the individual blocker is cue reading. And that's the thing we work on more than anything. And as coaches, I'll stress, especially in the early phase of the season here, you need to think of what situations occur in my matches, what attacks are we likely to see, and how can I recreate those with as little artificiality as possible. So for example, if you're coaching 15U girls, and I'd say the most common attack you're going to face, if you charted a full match, probably a high ball to left side would be the most common thing you're going to see. We need to try and recreate that situation so that it's repeatable, but in a way that the cues that are present are live. One sec here, just got a question. Explain touch 6. So touch 6, I see it across the province, across the country, in most gyms. It's a simple defensive drill, typically with 2 people in, that's not really tied to anything systematically. It's 2 people trying to defend the whole court, with a coach tossing balls around and athletes having to dive around and touch 6 in a row. So it can be great for having kids dive and hit the floor and not be afraid of the floor. But I think I see it happen most often when coaches watch 2 players look at one another and miscommunicate, and they get upset and they say, all right, we're doing touch 6. And in my opinion, that starts to turn defense for a lot of teams into something that they dread, that they don't want to dive, they don't want to hit the floor. So I think if we can spin it and make sure they think digging's fun, that's what we want, right? If they see touch 6 as what they want to do, that is phenomenal. Love that. Melissa, you said there that you asked for both players to touch the ball. I love a variation of touch 6 where not only do they have to touch it, but the second player has to try and make an actual high ball set out of the play. So not just what I see so often, they literally go and touch the ball, even putting it downward into the floor. So we definitely don't want to encourage our athletes to defend it downwards. So love that, Melissa. Yes, getting a second contact on it, that's awesome. Yeah, keep the questions coming. All good. So talking about artificiality. So if we think about what situations happen in matches the most often, we want to recreate those. And the only reason we would put in artificiality is if we're unable to get that sequence repeatable enough. So if say we're going to stick with that example, we want to defend left side attacks. If we're initiating the ball with athletes serving, and then we're relying on a half decent pass. Well, first off, let's back that up. We're relying on a serve that goes in, then we're relying on a half decent pass, then we're relying on the setter to make it actually hittable. And in a lot of club volleyball gyms, those 3 things aren't always going to happen on every rep. So especially say if we're at the 15U age, if we're relying on those 3 things to happen and only 1 in 4 times do we actually get a left side attack, our team defense gets 25% of the reps we should be getting. So a reasonable piece of artificiality to put in would be a coach or an athlete just bowling over a free ball, dead easy, so that we have a quality pass, we're never missing a serve, and we're going to get significantly more opportunities to actually defend that sequence, since that's what we're working on. So I ask our coaches all the time, okay, what's the objective of this drill? And if the objective is to work on defending left side, well, then we need to do that more often in this drill. If it's happening 1 in 4 balls, that's not enough. So as much as that's not exactly how it happens in a game, a coach isn't tossing a ball in, we're getting opportunities to work on those cues and to be able to defend around a live block and work on that block D cohesion there. Third bullet point there on the cue reading. I love asking questions because I feel like a lot of athletes learn that way, and we can actually see what their thought process was. So if rather than me just say, you're in the wrong place, you need to be 2 steps to your left, I can say, hey, what'd you see there? And if they say, you know, I was just on the edge of the block, my their left side was attacking and I'm playing defense in 5, and I thought I moved into a place where I could see the attacker. That's a perfect answer. Maybe they just got it a little bit wrong, but we've got to make sure that we're communicating that effectively. And if you give them a chance to explain themselves, it's not always going to be the right answer, but at least we know where they're coming from, and we can sort out any misconceptions that may be out there. So rather than just barking at them, ask questions, because they may well not even understand the concept that you're working on. So into the third point here, I think this one gets worked on the most, and I'm probably going to back up from technical to go into cue reading again in a second here. But the main pieces I think are the most important for an individual defender, for a digger, is weight on your big toes. And that sounds bizarre, I realize that. And wherever you are right now, sitting on the couch or in your home office or wherever the heck you are, I'd encourage you, try for a split second here to just move your weight side to side as though you're pushing off and going to your left or right. It's the big toes that are making that happen. And if you're trying it right now, thank you. And if you think about that, we often have defenders that are playing defense and their feet are pointing kind of out on a 45-degree angle. A lot of the time that's because of tight hips and an inability to bend. But if your athletes physically can, we want to make sure that they are at least feet straight ahead, and ideally a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit with their toes in, a little bit pigeon-toed, because that puts you in a place where not only can your weight be forward, but you can be calm and paused. But we want to be, oh, Melissa, my audio cut out. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Hey, Pat, you've been fine this whole time.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So as far as big toes, we want to have our toes slightly in, our feet pointing slightly in, so that when we need to make those split-second reads, we don't have to shift the weight in our feet to then push off of our big toes. So big toes are a big one as far as blockers and attackers. Tinker with your athletes, allow them to put their feet out, then put their feet forward, and then just a tiny little bit pigeon-toed. Because it'll really help them, especially in the OVA where you see so many tips and rolls and off-speed stuff. Your athletes will be better able to get forward and dig those tips. So next thing, palms up. We want palms up because it's going to make it a little bit easier to move whether the ball's hit left or right outside the body. And that ties into the next point there, the independent hand movement. We want, if the ball's attacked to the right side of the defender's body, we want, like a back catcher in baseball, we want the body moving first, our right arm going out first, followed by our left arm. We do not want the hands to go together in front of the body and then swing out towards the ball. That's where you get the skipping stone, where the ball skims off the arms and goes up into the top of the gym. So again, palms out, kind of parallel to your thighs. And if the ball's hit outside the body, whichever way it's hit, body moves first, hips are behind the ball, outside arm goes out first, and then the trail arm meets it. And this is going to tie into now the actual blocker-defender relationship, is the difference between being mobile and being stable. So the terms on ball and off ball we're going to talk about here a little bit. But that kind of ties into you at this phase of the season thinking, okay, what's my context? Am I coaching 14U or 16U, 18U, or even older? What type of attacks do we need to see? Or what type of attacks do we need to defend? What type of attacks do we see? And what type of defense makes the most sense to defend that? So the blocker defender. At this stage of the year, we probably don't all know exactly what athletes we're going to have on our teams, but what we do know is an idea of what type of system we want to have. And I think it's important to preface all this by saying when the ball's on the other side of the net, they have the advantage. They are supposed to score, whether it's 14U or 18U or anywhere in between, and 12U. The offense is supposed to score. So not getting discouraged is a huge one, and knowing that if we're not making the play as a team, if they're scoring on us, that we need to be able to say whose assignment that was, essentially. So it is a constant that we are working together. That is always the case. It is 6 defenders working in unison. Every single person has a job, no matter where the ball goes on the other side of the net. Everyone has a different section of the court that they're responsible for, and they need to trust that system. I could go through the exact system we do at Fanshawe College with our men's team. We've had a ton of success with it, but that's not it'd be fun for me, but that's not relevant most likely for your coaching context. So I'm going to try and talk more abstract, more about concepts, and if you have any really specific questions, I will be more than happy to go on a rant about our team's defensive system. So back to the mobility versus stability. If you think about, actually, I'm going to skip ahead for a split second here. If we think about defensive posture, one more, there we go. Smiling guys on my Fanshawe team, Najim. If we think about defensive posture, so often we picture the guy on the left. Okay, really wide base, palms out. That defensive posture says, I'm prepared to dig a hard-driven ball, right? And that is the posture we want when we can see the ball. So the term on ball, skip to the bottom here, the term on ball means I can see the attacker. Okay, I've made the right read, I'm outside of the block, so I can see the attacker and they can physically attack the ball with pace at me. So we do want to have a wider base. We want to be a little bit lower to the ground. We want to be able to cover more range, left to right, without going off balance. And if you have a narrower base, you're going to be quicker to go off balance. And when you go off balance, you're significantly less likely to actually make the dig. Being on ball is not always what we want, and I'll chat a bit about that in a sec, but essentially the on-ball defender looks like an infielder in baseball. It's the exact same concept, and if that helps some of your athletes understand the difference between on-ball and off-ball, it's as simple as the infielder in baseball has to be prepared for a hard hit ball that's going to be hit at them quite quickly. And if you think of the infielders in baseball as the blockers, the outfielders, it's not going to get hit at them right away, so they have a bit of time. So they can be more upright, a little bit narrower in their base, because they're more ready to run. So that off-ball position is, I think, so important for the younger ages because they don't see hard hit balls. And typically at the 12, 13, 14, 15U ages, when balls get attacked, they're probably going to score anyway if someone's hitting it with a lot of pace, but it's those off speed. And for any coaches that are out there that are coaching younger ages, you know how frustrating it is because you see the tip, they see the tip, but it's too late. And so if we can help them with their cue reading by adjusting their posture, and the term that I use a lot is that you want your posture to reflect your view. And I don't need to have a really wide base and be ready for a really hard hit ball if there's a blocker directly between me and the attacker. Okay, that blocker means it can't get hit at me. Therefore, I want to be more mobile, more off ball, and looking like the gentleman on the right there, that's a position that he can break from and go dig those tips significantly easier and quicker than the girl on the left there. It's going to take her a bit of time to actually work her feet together and then start to sprint. Right? If we think of this as sprinters in the Olympics, they don't look like either of these people, but they look a lot more like the guy on the right. Okay, so in volleyball context, there's Najim. When he is on ball, on the left there, he can see the attacker. He's ready for a hard hit ball. He's lower to the ground. That's a better position to dig a hard hit ball. But if it was an attacker that's not very likely to hit the ball, say like you see at younger ages, or there's a blocker between him and the ball, then he can go into that position he is on the right, where he's all smiley and happy and ready to dig tips and rolls and stuff that goes off the block. Okay, so I find at our level, more often they're missing the dig, not because of their inability to do the skill itself, but because they didn't put themselves in the right posture to react to the attack that was coming. All right. Any questions at all, if there are, about on ball versus off ball? I would say the younger ages, for sure, you're going to spend way more time off ball because you don't need to be as stable. You need to be more mobile and prepared to move for tips and rolls and miss hits, because it's hard to know where they're going to hit it if they don't know where they're going to hit it. All right, so as far as the blocker and defender relationship, the goal of this team defense, in my opinion, isn't just to defend the ball. Obviously, the goal, we want to be defending every single ball. We want to make it very tough for them to score, for sure. We want to force errors, which in our gym, we celebrate their errors, not because they messed up, right? It's not to shove it in their face. It's because they've been trained that when the other team tries to do too much, maybe they get dug hitting to 5, then they try and swing to 1 and they get dug there, then they try and swing to the middle of the court and they get blocked, then they make a different decision and try and make a different shot, and they make an error. So they made that error not just because they made an error, but they made a conscious decision based on getting stopped in other areas. So but yes, goal of defense is not just to defend, it's to help us guide our training. So when we're going through working on our systems, if consistently one area is being abused on our team, if we're getting scored on in the same way, that's not necessarily that our system is broken and we need a new one. That just means that there's a specific area where we need to work on. And I've got a couple trying to apply this here as best you can through this webinar forum, and we'll tackle that there at the end. Touched on a little bit at the start, but the front row back row relationship is everything. We need to make sure blockers know that they can do their job perfectly without ever touching the ball. Working with younger boys specifically, I noticed that it takes a bit for them to genuinely understand that if they went up to block the ball and the attacker hit around them, that they still did their job as long as they were a disciplined, straight up and down, penetrated blocker. We don't get to decide where the attacker hits it, obviously. So when a blocker performs their skill perfectly, even though if they're not rewarded with a block, we need to make sure we're praising them and celebrating the process of them doing everything right, so that when an attack does get hit into their block, they are punishing the other team and actually getting a stuck block. And for me, this is probably the biggest of all the points in this presentation. The most important point that started to trigger a lot of team defensive success with my Fanshawe guys is genuinely understanding that we are not going to stop every single attack from scoring. That's completely unrealistic. When the ball's on their side, they've got the advantage. But we need to know that everybody understands their assignments, everybody understands whose job is whose, that if the ball gets set to right side and it's a back row setter, that each of our defenders and blockers know exactly what's expected of them. And again, the goal is not to be able to play the blame game if somebody doesn't do their job, but that means that if it's our blockers that are being undisciplined and waving their arms around and or not getting penetrated, at least we know, okay, it's our inability to block that we need to work on. If our blockers are doing an excellent job and taking away their space and the ball is getting hit into a gap in the block, that defender needs to know, okay, we need to work on filling gaps, and maybe we don't do enough drills in practice where we recreate this situation. So for me, each time we get scored on, it's pretty simple that it's usually someone's assignment that wasn't done properly. And we can just kind of keep a running tally of that, whether it's in your head or on paper. And again, that's not to beat anyone over the head with it. That's just to be able to realize, okay, that aspect of our system needs to be worked on. Or if it's happening enough, or you're working on it in training and it's just not happening, then maybe we need to consider changing our system. When we have success on our assignments, it builds greater trust, that blockers don't feel a need to reach outside their shoulders, because we want our blockers always in a strong position, arms in front of their shoulders, not reaching outside their shoulders. We want straight up and down. So that's building trust between the front row and the back row. And if we fail in our assignment, which is going to happen sometimes, that helps us guide the training. And if we feel like it's not happening and we need to consider changing our system, then we'll change our system. A perfect example of this, and I hope this is applicable for a good chunk of the people out there. Middle blockers. I think middle blockers get beat over the head with the concept that you have to close every block. Well, once you hit a certain age, it is totally unreasonable to expect a middle to close every single block, right? If the other team is setting left and right side with any type of speed, they're not going to close, most likely, especially at the club level. So in those situations where the middle's not closing, we train our middles to get as far as you can and get straight up and down. Okay, that usually means, especially for the first half or 2/3 of the season, they are not going to close the block, which means there's going to be a gap. And that's Zone 6's job, to make sure that they are filling the gap, that they are seeing the attacker through the hole in the block, and putting themselves in a place that the ball is either going to hit the middle blocker, the outside blocker, or it's going to get hit in between, and we've got a defender there. Okay, the benefit of this is that it's clearly one person's job. Okay, if it goes down the front of a blocker, it was the blocker's fault. If the ball got hit and it hit the floor, and the defender was out of position, well, we need to work on cue reading in the backcourt and making sure that we can fill gaps appropriately. But to me, that made such a big difference and allowed us to be always working forward on a point versus having middles who were reaching way outside their body with arms almost parallel to the top of the net, just trying to get touches on the block, only to get tooled left, right, and center. And as a team, we're not getting any better. So for those middles, they're getting a little bit closer to closing and a little bit closer to closing, but there's an actual process underway rather than just saying, we need you to close every time. So when they're reaching outside their body, we got to let them know they can't do that. All right, I think I might have gone into this a little bit already. So a couple situations here. Number one, the ball keeps rattling around our blocker's arms and scoring. So whether that's getting tooled or going down the front, and it's not giving our defense a chance to dig it. I see this all the time in the OVA and high school volleyball. And what, for whatever reason, usually gets said to blockers is, oh, you got to angle it back in there, a good touch, or you'll get the next one. And that positivity is great and all, but in my opinion, I think the feedback can be on blocker discipline, saying in whatever way you feels most appropriate for that athlete, hey, let's make sure you Billy in zone 6 there. Give him a chance to dig that, right? Nope, don't reach. Trust him. He's going to make the play. With our guys, I just have a little bit of fun with them on that, so that so we all stay super positive and say, hey, like, you're not trusting your boy back there. If you don't trust him, we're not getting better as a team. And then we kind of laugh it off, and then the next time, if they are straight up and down and reaching across the net, and there's a gap in the block, and the defender fills it and doesn't make the dig, well, at least we know that that's something we need to work on, right? There's just it's all about being able to identify where things are going wrong rather than just shrugging it off when the other team scores. So point 2, or situation 2, pretty similar to what we're talking about there. I see it happen where defenders aren't making digs and blockers think that, well, if it gets past the net, we're not digging it. So I need to go and try and get every single block. Obviously, there's the odd time it may work out for them, taking more risk as a blocker, but we want all 6 players working together. And the difficult piece here is the blocker is going to be rewarded sometimes for taking more risk, but we need to make sure if we look at the numbers in the big picture, if they're being undisciplined and reaching way outside their body 10 times, maybe once are they rewarded and get a block. But a good chunk of the time, they're going to get tooled. It's going to go down their front. They're going to touch the net. And all those things can be happening. And the defenders behind them have absolutely no idea where to go. So with the Fanshawe guys, we noticed that the defenders in the backcourt can already start to tell if the blockers are going to be able to close the block or where our blockers are going to be, and they can trust that they're not going to be reaching outside their body. So they're looking at the physical body, not wondering where their arms are going to wind up. All right. So I'm hoping this is the part here where it's going to actually generate a bit of discussion, and I'm more than happy to help. I'm not sure what the ages are here that are being coached by the 31 of you. But for me, the questions you should be asking yourself or your assistant coaches, your head coach or your technical director in the club, or whomever it is you chat with about these types of things, when you're deciding what system to be running or what systems to be running, think to yourself, what attacks do we see the most often? So if I'm a 14U boys coach, what attack do I see the most often? Again, probably a set to left side that's not overly fast. So if I'm working on my team defense, not that it's just about winning the most matches, but in terms of them understanding the odds and the numbers game that playing defense is, it's them recognizing that that's a situation they need to be able to defend at a greater rate than anything else, because it's going to happen 60 or 70% of the time. So think, what attacks in our league do we see the most often? A similar but pretty different question, in my opinion, is what attacks are actually the most effective? And I'll go into that a little bit at the college level. Some pretty radical changes we've made that everyone thinks are bonkers, but we do year in, year out to a lot of success. Next question to be asking yourself and those around you: what's the level of athleticism and the actual ability of our athletes? So do you have a 12U team where nobody can actually get over the top of the height of the net? Right, that's obviously a huge factor in determining what type of defensive system you're going to be running. Not just the current athleticism, but what can we kind of project here? Is this reasonable to think it's, say, boys in their 15 or 16U year, and there's going to be quite a bit of growth, not just in their height, but in the length of their arms? Is it reasonable that by the end of the year, we're going to be able to accomplish these tasks? And last questions, thinking a little bit at their next level. I think it's important that we always kind of have their next steps in mind. We don't need to be living in their next steps, but we need to be mindful of their next level. Is what type of attacks do they need to be able to defend when they move on from being coached by you? So in my context at the college and even at 17-18U coaching boys at LBC is essentially we don't block back row attacks very often. We train the ability to defend those attacks, and we work hard at that so that we actually can defend those attacks, and it puts us in a place where we're better able to transition into attack. And what I need to be mindful of is whether it's, or say at Fanshawe, we're sending athletes here and there off to the national team program, where obviously they will need to learn how to block back row attacks. So making sure that I'm mindful that although on our team we're not going to block the C ball, when they move on to Gatineau, they definitely will be. So at some point they need to be able to do those skills. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit into specifics here. I've got a couple visuals. This was a lot easier to do on Sunday in person. So I'm going to do my best here. You're probably going to have questions, so please speak up. So the first defensive system that I think teams need to have is an in-system defense. So when the other team has a really good pass, when they can run middle, and how you defend a front row setter. I coached a few years ago at the 17-18U girls side, and that was about the only time, and it was infrequent, but that was about the only time where I saw people try to make up for not having a right side in the front row. And it was only a couple teams that ran step arounds or slides or whatever you want to call them, that kind of throws this system, throws a wrench into this system. But outside of that, I think all teams from once you go positional onward, so say 15U and above, it is significantly easier to defend a front row setter than it is to defend a back row setter. And if you think to yourself, oh, one sec, got a question here. At 14U girls, do we speed up the offense to catch the defense off guard? In my opinion, the systems are always dependent on what your abilities are. So if it's 14U girls, if your team can speed up the offense and run it successfully, obviously there's more risk involved, but there's a lot more reward. So I think it would depend on what personnel you have on your team. I think if I was coaching 14U girls and we wanted to try and speed the offense up, it's going to be much harder for them to defend, and they're not going to defend it as often. But if that means we're sacrificing the ability to actually get attacks, that would just be a numbers thing for me to try and weigh out to see, are we making attack errors at too great a rate to justify trying to speed it up. But for me, I think even at 14U, moving on, it's kind of off topic from my defense side, but I think at 14U girls, or 14U in general, I think they see it as like a trick play, but I think it's really helpful to have one regular speed that you set left side, but one that's a little bit faster, because that's just a little taste of the next level. They're only in 14U, so by no means do they need to be running any type of crazy pace. But if you can have them running it a little bit faster, whether it's on a free ball or whether it's on all good passes, I think that sets them up really well in terms of cue reading from an offensive point of view for later on in their club careers. So back to defending a front row setter. I'm going to skip ahead here. There we go. So I just did a little, what do you call it, a little screenshot of another presentation I have. But defending a front row setter, to me, we start licking our chops, whether it's my club guys or college guys. When we see a front row setter, we know we can get them stuck there. And when I say get them stuck, I mean we can go on a run of 3, 4, maybe more serves in a row, because essentially we only defend half the net. And I think this is a strategy that you could argue it may be short-sighted, but I think it's helpful from a tactical point of view to genuinely learn the game. That why would the player in zone 4, why do they normally go and stand way out at the antenna in zone 4 when nothing gets attacked out there. So whether it's 17U or college, we stand our zone 4 defender right smack in the middle of the court. The amount of times in a match that a setter actually dumps and means to dump, it doesn't justify the amount of respect we give them by putting a blocker permanently dedicated to them. So I'm sure for those coaches out there that are coaching 12, 13, 14, 15U, most of the time when you see a setter dump, it's just because the pass is too tight and they actually can't set it, that they just need to spill it over. So this player in zone 4 is responsible for following the setter if the ball is tight to the net. If the ball is even 2 feet off the net, leave the setter and go stand over in the middle of the court and help out the middle, your middle blocker defend their middle. That relieves a little bit of pressure on our middle here, which means they're in a bit of a help situation here because they've got this left side helping them out in the middle. And that means they are, that means they are going to be able to close to this player here. I'm going to go as far as say all of the time once you train this a little bit. Defending 4.5 meters is going to be significantly easier than defending 9 whole meters of the net. So for me, when there's nothing coming from their right side of the court, why do we designate a defender to go stand over there? I remember way back doing this as an athlete and being a left side standing in the middle of the court, and it felt pretty weird. But then you start to realize, wow, what was I doing over there all those years when nothing's getting attacked over there when they have a front row setter? As far as responsibilities there, you see zone 4, their primary responsibility is that middle attacker. So whether that's a 51 or a quick, whatever you call it, or whether that's a higher set in the middle, it just forces them to be thinking about the game and start to think about what type of attacks may be coming at you. Because really, we want to be defending the things that happen the most often. Okay. Moving on to the second one here. Oh, snap, 8:42 already. Moving on to the second one here, in-system defending a back row setter. So when we're playing in big matches at the college, we try and get a wash. So national semifinal, national final, we just want to break even when they have a back row setter. When they have a front row setter, we want to go on runs and get them stuck there and challenge them to try and score from zone 1 with their back row C ball. So the major change with back row setter is that this left side player obviously now has an attacker coming from the right side of the court. So we do need to defend the full 9 meters of the net. The really important piece here for training the athletes, I believe, is that they understand the why of all this and that you really get nitpicky about their initial defensive position, the IDP. I should have mentioned that a little bit earlier, but the IDP is critical. And if it's not enough for them to start like this and say, yeah, I know it's a front row setter now, but I'll move over when the time comes. No, we don't want that to happen live. When the ball's getting served, they should already be standing looking like this. And knowing that they're prepared for the options that are reasonably going to be coming their way. So again, I think a really helpful initial defensive position, IDP here, is us getting away from what we did back when I remember first learning about volleyball in kind of mid-90s, and probably happened before that, is I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here, but we played defense on the tee. So that was an IDP way over at the tee. And that was an IDP way over at this tee. And we stood our zone 6 defender way back here on the baseline, which requires loads of work, loads of running around. Our defenders are always on the move. We're defending things that are hit at us that are going out of bounds because most things above our ankle are out. No idea how they had time to move when a ball got attacked out of the middle of the court. So yeah, gone are the days of playing defense way out on the tees and on the baseline. Perimeter defense, kind of gone the way of the dodo. So IDPs here that are going to seem aggressive potentially to you, but roughly 1.5 meters or 2 meters off the sideline and 2 meters off the attack line, with zone 6 also playing really high into the court, so that if our middle blocker here isn't able to close and there's a gap in the block, well, this player is already high into the court, ready to fill that block. It's not like we need to be sprinting forward to try and dig a ball that's hit between the blockers. Okay, by starting this high, we're already this high into the court. The last bullet point here is really, really important, and not just in terms of being disciplined and having blockers not get tooled and give a good view for those behind them, is that late is okay, but being wrong is not. So if I'm the middle blocker here, I wait till I see the ball get set, and then they go chase. And when they're chasing, they're getting as far as they can before they feel they need to get their hands across the net. And if they're not all the way there to meet their wing blocker, that's okay. If a week goes by and they're an inch closer, that's awesome. And another week goes by and they're another inch closer to closing the block, that's awesome. And at least we're working towards something versus being undisciplined or guessing and just trying to go rogue, essentially. So we want to be working. These two guys, more importantly than anyone, zone 3 and zone 6 need to be working together. So the last one here, which I think is probably the most favorable situation for all coaches out there. Ideally, if we could start every rally like this when we're serving, that would be awesome. We're serving, we've served it, and they pulled up a poor pass. So the main difference here, once they make a bad pass, is that this defender right here has now gone all the way back to the baseline. And if you're wondering what the reason for that is, they don't need to stand high in the court on the expectation that the middle isn't going to close, because when it's a really poor pass, it's say behind the attack line, or maybe it's a non-setter, or maybe they have to use their forearms, we can trust if you've trained this properly, and it doesn't take long, whether it's 14U or 18U, it doesn't take long when they're at a system to train your middle to close to left or to right. So this player can trust fully that his middle blocker or her middle blocker is going to close the block, which allows this person to be a little bit further away from the ball, buying them time to make better reads. Just to throw a little wrinkle at you, if this is a front row setter on the other side of the net and they make a poor pass, well, the only option that we're blocking now is left side, because if they set their right side back here in the back row, we're not blocking that anyway. So we may as well send our blockers over to left side and just wait for them to set it there. That's kind of the one time where I allow our blockers to cheat, because that's the only ball we're blocking. If they wind up setting elsewhere, well, then back off the net and get ready to play defense. And our kind of the coaching cue that we use a lot here is for our zone 6 defender, we want you to move before the pass, like the serve reception attempt, hits its peak. So if that pass is going straight up in the air and they're going to have to set it from way back at the baseline, before that ball hits its peak, this player has already gone back, and by them moving back, they're saying, I trust you, you're going to close the block, we're going to have a cohesive block there, and nothing's getting through the middle of it. So again, not really sure what everyone's context is in the webinar here, whether it's mostly 12U or whether it's mostly 18U. I think this probably applied a little bit more to the older ages, and if you're with the younger ages, I'm sorry, and you can definitely pop some questions in here. I'd be really happy to chat about your context if that's the case. But my stance on this is there's no absolute right or wrong. Because the Fanshawe men's team doesn't block the C-ball, that doesn't mean you shouldn't either. But it's all about what's going to give you levels of effectiveness in your context. And thinking about that, it's what do you need to defend? Most of the time at the club level, it's quicks in the middle, 51s, whatever you call them, and high ball sets to left side. And so for a system that needs to face that, that's quite simple. If it's a more complex context you're in, then we need to be combining what do we need to defend, what typically scores at the greatest rates, and maybe most importantly here, what are your athletes actually capable of doing? Because your system, you can't put a system in place that doesn't align with what you're capable of. I've been super lucky at Fanshawe that I've had athletes that play really strong defense. So because they play really good defense, that allows us to not block, or choose to not block a lot of attacks because we're leaning on our defenders. We find that way we don't get tooled on things that are diggable, right? It's easier to control a ball when you're digging it than it is to control it when it's getting hit inches from your hands as a blocker, right? So we don't want to get tooled by things that shouldn't be scoring anyway. And as you go through, I think it's important that if your system is that you don't defend back row attacks, you need to be able to make small adjustments for specifically stronger opponents, but also weaker opponents. If you're facing a team that all of a sudden has a really strong pipe hitter or a really strong C-ball hitter, well, you can't really just fall on your sword and accept the defeat if you say, hey, we don't block the C-ball and they're scoring on us, so I guess they win. You need to be able to train that, and though it's not your base system, if you're facing those type of attacks, we need to be able to in match make that adjustment after a quick timeout or a quick call in from the coach. So I'm gonna leave it there. I'm probably already almost at time, so I'm gonna leave it there and ask if there are any questions at all. Please fire them in there. I'd be happy to talk about your specific teams you have coming up this fall. All right, got one here. 11U, obviously I'll not see many attacks. Still like to have blockers at the net and then them transition to defense except for one blocker. Good or bad? I think that's kind of what I was talking about earlier with thinking about the next level they're going to need to get to. So as much as you're not going to see a ton of attacks, I think that's really forward thinking where say they set left side, having your blocker that's in zone 2, having them make the motion to go block so that they're getting the opportunity to jump, to land without them realizing it. Sorry, they're working on things like blocking alignment, right? So if that set falls inside, I think it's really valuable that you teach them that. If you're then following up with, hey, that set fell inside, let's make sure you don't go too far past the ball and just run over to the antenna. You got to be seeing where the attacker is actually approaching in, and then they have the additional benefit of landing, opening up, finding the ball, transitioning to attack. I think it might be a bit much if you added in a middle there that went chasing the attack as well and might cause some 11U chaos, but I think there's a ton of value in having that one blocker go up and have to deal with the stress of going from block to attack. And sorry, just in case there's okay, sweet. Yeah, and I think on that note, again, I'm just gonna go one step further. I think the tricky bit may be getting them to fully buy in, especially their parents or parents. You may see parents saying, why are we blocking? No one can get over the net and no one's even attacking. They're not thinking about the developmental side of things, obviously, but I think given that they're not going to be blocking a lot of balls, it may be a tough sell at times for the athletes. But I think if you're able to give them positive feedback and praise for good alignment or for working really hard in transition, those are skills that are going to transfer into their volleyball careers beyond 11U that maybe they won't realize it, but it'll be due to your forward thinking that allowed them to make that smoother transition than having to do it for the first time at 14 or 15U. 15U girls, short but athletic team. What sort of defending would you suggest? Obviously, blocking is out. So I think if you are, so they're 15U, they may still be growing a little bit. But if we are convinced there that they're not going to be growing, tricky one. I would say there's value I'm assuming they're getting at least like fingertips over the net. If it's even fingertips, most of the balls that are getting attacked in the OVA, whether it's 11U or 18U, most of the balls that are getting attacked are at tape height that aren't really going that much higher above the net. So I think maybe they'd be surprised how many balls they would touch. But I would suggest kind of the same thing as I was talking about with Lou there, that having your one blocker that the ball, whatever zone the balls get set in, having that blocker align, take away space. My best advice there would be if they set left side, we have our zone 2 blocker leave some line so that the defender in 1 on our team has something to defend, but their responsibility is making sure it doesn't get hit straight down into the 1-6 seam. So then at least, again, we're working together as a team. We're defending around that blocker because we know what zone she's taking away. And even if they're not even fingertips over the top of the net, they can, if they jump a little bit backwards, they'll get a ton of touches on the ball. Especially if bigger attackers think there's no one there, they are going to get so many slowdowns. And I think that's going to do more positive for your team, not just in defending more balls, but in them building towards the future where obviously 16, 17, 18U, they're going to have to do some blocking in order to have a successful team defense. So I think there's value in getting that one blocker out there to try and slow down some balls. Hope that helped there, Ben. Thank you. Kevin, do you start practicing these skills early in the season? For me, in my context, we get into our defensive system. That's probably the first 2 weeks is ball control, serve receive, and our defensive system. We don't get into offense usually for much later. For me, it's them sitting in a classroom first and foremost, talking about the understanding of whose job is whose, because it's really hard in the moment for them to not just understand our team defensive system, but to be able to physically perform it at the speed it's happening. I think it needs to happen first in a calm, whether it's a whiteboard session before practice, or even if club coaches wanted to draw up little charts. Defense isn't X marks the spot, but it can give you an idea of at least a starting point from which to make your reads. So for me, defense should happen earlier in the season than offense. And then as we're working on offense, we can have a defense that's trying to function and defend the ball at as great a rate as possible. Then while we're working on offense, we're also poking holes in our defensive system that we've already worked on for quite a while. Okay, thanks for that question, Kevin. Mark, what blocking drills do you employ? It's fun for the athletes, 15U boys. For 15U boys, I would say getting them used to the feeling of actually blocking the ball. Like grade 9 boys love to block the ball and get like real big stuff blocks. So if you have the ability to have boxes, I know that's not something every club team has access to, but some type of stable and safe thing you can stand on, as simple as them getting across with proper footwork and getting their hands across the net and them getting used to the feeling of having a true stuff block. It's totally isolated and it's totally artificial, but that's a really good starting point for them to kind of get addicted to the feeling of roofing a ball or whatever they want to call it. So I think really important that the footwork has to be there first. And I'll just take 10 seconds here real quick. Footwork wise, 15U boys aren't going to be able to cover a ton of ground, but the stronger ones, it should be a small first step that puts them kind of knee over toe, shoulder over knee, kind of into a sprinter's pose, and then a really large second step that closes to where they want to get to, and then a third step that brings their foot perpendicular to the net and allows them to go straight up and down. If you've got proper footwork and you're able to attack consistently into their hands, and they can get that feeling of a stuff block and make sure that they're penetrating, make sure the ball isn't going down the front of them, that's a really effective way, I believe, to get them bought into blocking. Because if you just try and operate it in the organic environment in which it actually happens, you may get 1 in 10 times that it's a pass, a set that's hittable, or a pass that's settable, a set that's hittable, and then a swing that actually goes anywhere near the blocker. So we're not working on what we're trying to get better at. So isolating it like that, I think, works really well for 15Us. And teaching closing. For me, my favorite thing, love working with middles. I worked with our middles tonight on this specifically. We do a lot of isolated block work first, on the method 1, where they just go, say, to their right. So our middles are just going, pretending to block the other side's left side. So we do a lot of work where we tap them on the shoulder, and that's their stimulus. So they're waiting in their IDP, hands up, someone comes up behind them, taps them on the shoulder. Sweet middle blocker drill stolen from Chris Lawson, and they head out to their blocking position in position 2 and get across the net. And we emphasize at all times, no lazy hands. Even if we're working on footwork, no lazy hands at the top. And it's going to be the second step that's going to determine how much closer to closing they get. And I think if they do that motion enough, eventually they're going to get closer and closer and closer before, and before you know it, they'll be closing and hitting shoulders with the zone 2 and 4 blockers, which is what we want. Thanks for the question, Mark. Lou, at a young age, do you see value in sticking with 6 back or realizing volume tips occurring and using 6 up? Ooh, super good question. I think I haven't gone below 16U in quite a while, but I think there's value in having a 6 up if that's where a lot of the balls get attacked to. The downside I see to that is, again, thinking about their next steps as volleyball players. Once they get into the older ages, the 6 up defense is kind of hard to transition from, and it doesn't work all that well at the higher ages. So while it's going to be really effective short term, I think it would maybe be helpful to have both a 6 up and a 6 back as working systems, because I totally get it. There's going to be a ton of tips and just stuff that seems to land in the middle of the court. But I like having a system where if you, let's say they're setting left side, either we have 1 blocker up, the zone 2 blocker, and our middle goes and kind of deals with tips and stuff in the middle of the court, or we actually have 2 blockers go, the zone 2 and the zone 3 blockers go out to block, and the zone 4 blocker on our side comes underneath and digs the tips. So the person that's on the opposite side of where the ball's been set, they go underneath and dig tips. That allows them to progress a little bit easier to the higher levels where they're probably not going to have a 6 up. Barb, what's your starting point for teaching reading for the libero, 16U girls? So are you, Barb, if you can quickly message in there, are you playing your libero in zone 5 or zone 6? I think that's probably the most important starting point on that one. If you can just fire that, zone 6. Okay. So if you have your libero in zone 6, I would say the best way to teach them reading, and typically it's going to be filling the gap in the block. That's kind of the role of zone 6. I see zone 5 and 1's job as kind of defending down the line, between the antenna and the outside blocker. And when they're defending cross court, defending outside the edge of the entire block. So zone 6 for me, their job is to be filling the gaps between blockers. And we start, sorry, when you say starting point, do you mean where do we even start, or where physically on the court is that starting point for that zone 6 defender? Because if the question, and just while you're typing that, if the question is where's their physical starting point, I would suggest at 16U that they are at the 6 meter mark, so halfway between the attack line and the baseline, because I think that's where a lot of the balls get attacked, and ultimately the ball has to get hit through you if you're in the right place. Where do we start in teaching reading? Okay, where do we start in teaching reading? I think the best way to do this, a simple drill, if you have access to a couple of boxes or even something sturdy you can stand on, ball gets tossed into the setter on the other side away from the defender. That setter sets left or right side. That ball itself, it's tricky to actually contact that ball if you're already up on a box. So you could even just let that go past you. Have the middle come across. So while the middle is working on actually closing, you're working on the zone 3 and zone 6 kind of relationship there. So I think you start with it in the system you use. I'm a firm believer, even at the younger ages, that you teach the skills through the systems. That allows it to transfer quite comfortably into the game versus just working on it in isolation, in like permanently in a method 1 isolated situation. So I'd say you can get right into it where the ball gets set and you have attackers that are accurate and able to hit it through the gap consistently. So while the middle is working on closing to their left and right, the zone 6 defender is working on positioning themselves in the gap in the block where they can put themselves in an on-ball position and actually see the attacker. And probably the most important piece of this in it actually transferring into the game and in you giving them quality feedback is where you stand. So anytime we're working on filling gaps, the coach needs to be standing directly behind that defender so that they can actually see what the defender's seeing. I see it so often where a coach will see the defender make the dig, but they're in a position where there's no chance they know if they were in the right spot or not. And just because they dug it doesn't mean they're in the right spot. And the coach will give them all kinds of praise saying, oh, great dig, great job, good read. But you're guessing based on the results. So I think you need to be standing directly behind the defender to know if they made the right read or not. So I hope that kind of answered your question, but I think where to start, apply it into the system and try and make it as, try and reduce the artificiality as much as you can, but have artificial things such as coaches on boxes or whatever you have when you need that level of control. Because if you have live attackers attacking in there, 16U, you might get an opportunity to make that read 1 in 10 times. And if that's the rate of success, then that's not going to be good enough to actually get better at what you're trying to get at. We need a little more volume there. Okay, sweet. Glad I could help.